Good morning. This is another video um, for Citizen Speaks, and I'm Stephen Polgar. Um, and I would appreciate it if you click the like button and subscribe to make it worthwhile for me to continue with these videos. This one is the second portion of recollections, autobiographical recollections. As I said before, I don't really believe in autobiography as such, but uh, basing this as a story about experiences that were similar to the ones I've had. So let's go to the second installment. Corporal punishment and his father's intent on molding S to be a success, despite the many obstacles that lay in his path, was one part of his spiritual development. The other one was his complex relationship with his mother. The adjective complex is a cliche describing the relation between the mother and the son, since there are no simple ways a mother and son could relate to each other. No matter how conscious the mother is, nor how careful to prevent the spiritual bond between her and her son from becoming harmful. In S's case, the requirement of his mother's consciousness was sorely missing. Kata, or Kate, was only 19 and a half when S was born. A girl whose teenage years were spent in a country enveloped by war and terror. Hungary didn't enter the war until 1942, and even for the first year and a half of that participation, there was an illusion of peace until March 19th, 1944, the day the German army invaded the country and effectively took control of its fate. Kata was the granddaughter of David Anjal, originally Engel, a respected history professor who had converted from his Jewish faith to Catholicism in his 20s. His interest in Hungarian literature and history could not be pursued at the end of the 19th century without making this change. Like so many of his contemporaries, he was more preoccupied with reason and how it could be applied to subjects like literature and history, so he treated religion as a matter of tradition. His story is worthy of another book. For now, the significance of his presence was that he was the head of the family, consisting of his daughter Paula, separated from her husband, and his granddaughter Kata, or Kate. They lived in an apartment large enough for the three of them and accommodating his study, which he used every day, even in his 80s. In 1942, he wrote his memoirs there, those who were eventually published in 1971 by the Hungarian emigre group Sepsi Csombor Kör, or Circle, in England. He urged Kata to finish her study of Hungarian literature at the university, but dying in 1943, he did not witness her abandonment of those studies. That decision was influenced by the chaos of the year 1944 and her involvement with S's father, who managed to flee the work camp at József and arrived in Budapest a few weeks before the Soviet army encircled Pest, and the battle began to take the fortified heights of Buda, defended by the Germans. Kata was a bright, short, blonde, and buxom girl who attended the Angol Kisasszonyok Gymnasium, literally English young ladies' high school, the best Catholic girls' high school in the city. The reason for the name was that its founder, Maria Ward, had established the order in France for the daughters of English Catholics who had fled in the wake of the schism between Rome and King Henry VIII. Kata was the classmate of the daughters of many influential families. They were taught at the exceptional level of characteristic of Hungary's church-run schools. She was a successful student and often mentioned her participation in and showed pictures of a stage performance put on by the school as part of its senior year celebration. Her spiritual development and character were affected by the broken marriage of her father and mother. S knew his grandfather Antal Anthony, an occasionally gregarious hypochondriac who spent summer months at his sister's home on the outskirts of the town of Esztergom. S and his sister were also at this house for some of the summers, so he interacted with his bookish grandfather there and saw him in Budapest at his parents' home and on visits to his not so efficient one room apartment. S was closest to his grandmother Paula, who spent a lot of time with the boy. How these two affected his mother Kata was revealed to S over many years of trying to unravel the strings tying them to each other. He was made aware of the importance of knowing his two surviving grandparents by the immeasurable loss of the two he never met. They, just like his mother's grandfather, were the mysteries known only through the stories of his parents and a few of their relatives and friends whom S met as a boy. Only photographs remained to remind the family of them. S remembered particularly the black and white one of his grandmother, Barbara. It sat on his father's ornate desk under the window of the living room. These and others remained in the family and eventually in S's possession as their only mementos. David Angyal had left much written evidence of who he was and how he thought in his many writings. These were supplemented by the recollections of his students and historians who wrote about his contributions to the study and understanding of Hungarian history. The two different ways of knowing his grandparents and his outsized great-grandfather provided a contrast in the way he understood his parents. Whereas he had to rely on his father's recollections and perspective about his parents, in his mother's case, his grandparents were a continuing part of S's life. More personal interactions were broken by the long hiatus between 1957 and 1965, the years when S grew up outside of Philadelphia and couldn't visit the country of his birth. He and his family were still considered to have broken Hungarian law by crossing the border illegally. Then in 1963, the Hungarian government relaxed the travel restrictions on the hundreds of thousands of 1956 refugees. That provided S an opportunity to see his beloved grandmother and the grandfather to whom he wasn't as emotionally attached, but who had certainly played what proved later to be a uniquely important role in his life. These two grandparents held the key to his understanding of his mother. The way they related to her as a child and girl, combined with the shattering of the illusions of safety and security that accompanied her early teenage years, proved as destructive for Kata's spiritual development as the ones alluded to above in George's early life. The dark clouds of family history that were described to S by his parents cast their shadows whether they were conscious or not of their presence. The scary, upsetting stories for the boy were his parents' endless reality. Could they have come to terms with the terror of murder and destruction by some means familiar to us who live in a world in which everyday reality is not filled with unbounded evil? In a country where crime and evil are imperfectly limited and punished by government authority, it is impossible to imagine one where the authorities are the criminals and the individual must outwit them to survive. Kata survived using the same kind of bravery when facing the agents of Nazi power as her future husband had. She had to suppress the fear of the teenage girl she was and instead act the authoritative, empowered blonde woman who was not to be deterred even by the gendarmes armed with bayonets. The image that stayed with us was the one related to him about how she had gone into the ghetto in Pest, where her relatives and future husband were concentrated so they could be more easily murdered or at least die of disease and hunger. She pulled a cart filled with food and supplies to the gate and somehow succeeded in passing the gauntlet of the Arrow Cross guards to deliver these essentials for the survival of those close to her. Since she was only classified as half Jewish and was the picture of what was the ignorant considered a blonde Aryan woman, she succeeded. S understood the significance of these brave acts of bravery and sanguine self-confidence many years later. They are required for survival, but they provide no solid basis for living in situations not fraught with danger and destruction. Mundane, quiet times with hidden undercurrents of danger and uncertainty require steadier, less transitory confidence, one based in consciousness and the ability to develop a wider perspective. Whereas in moments of extreme danger, the threatened must take sudden, instinctive decisions, days of quiet, even keeled life require lasting stability. S found out as he grew up that both parents, successful survivors of extreme situations, lacked the ability to live ordinary lives and to raise um, children who could succeed in them. That lack of ability was probably the product of a shattered moral system. S's parents had grown up in a small European country suffering the consequences of the destruction of the Judeo-Christian foundations of European civilization and culture. Even those who pretended to firm beliefs in the remnants of these sometimes proved to be hypocrites. They often demonstrated how shallow their morality was in the grave situations which were the consequences of the shattering of these foundations. The need to fight for survival trumped the moral choices, except for the bravest willing to sacrifice their lives, like his youthful uncle Tomasz. People compromised morality for the sake of survival. Later in his life, emulating the rare few, S paid dearly for his unwillingness to compromise in crucial situations. His earliest memories of his 20-odd-year-old mother were vignettes. Kata worked full-time as a teacher at a high school and then taught shorthand at a now nationalized private school for secretaries. S and his sister saw her in the morning rushing to prepare for work and in the evenings at supper time or weekends. S's memories of his mother included the one about the hot bricks in bed on winter nights when the apartment was not heated, and outings such as his first communion. The family celebrated the event by going to Budapest's fanciest confectionery, then named after the 19th century poet Vörösmarty, but still referred to by its pre-war name of Gerbeau, after the man who had been invited from Paris by original owner to run the shop and produce what came to be known throughout Europe as exceptional desserts. Under state management, the quality and variety might have declined, but S could not judge that. He was happy for dessert, and especially the unusual treat of ice cream. Now and then she took us with her to the Radnoj's shorthand and typing school, where she taught and introduced him to her colleagues. These visits were a kind of demonstration of her success in having and raising a handsome, smart little boy. She tended to emphasize the external, social significance of motherhood to S's disappointment. He preferred his mother to himself, kind and loving when they were alone, rather than displaying him as a trophy. She didn't understand how important the distinction was for the child. His mother was the only person whose love and attention he required. Other people, the external world, didn't mean much to him, and because of her emphasis on it in these early years, remained suspect to him for most of his life. Even after he understood more about its complex, hard to comprehend, endless details, he never felt at ease with strangers and disliked large groups of people. Although he could put on the social attitude required for acceptance or its mundane form of popularity, he never felt comfortable doing so. He always saw himself acting this way and was amused by his own dexterity. Somewhere it reminded him of having been paraded in front of strangers, the dressed up, well groomed product of mommy's efforts. The bad memories remained, like the time when in an angry moment Kata called his little 5-year-old sister a whore. Though S was not old enough to grasp the significance of that epithet, the moment stayed with him, and especially the irreconcilable crying and the look of terror, of utter abandonment in his little sister's face. Even after almost 70 years, you could see the kitchen at the end of the hallway and a dining room that opened behind a set of glass doors on the right of that hallway. Little Bori, her chest and brown hair disheveled, tears streaking down her cheeks, came running out of the kitchen. She tried to open the dining room door but couldn't reach the handle, so she ran through the partially open bathroom door on the same side of the hallway. He could hear her bawling, but he couldn't remember how the crisis was resolved. Did he try to console the little girl, whom on weekdays he walked to the preschool across from Perthsker's Minute Park? His memory's failure may have been a sign that these kinds of hurts cannot be healed. A mother wounding a 5-year-old like this, no matter how unconsciously, cannot remove the hurt. She can apologize, make amends, but the scar in a child's mind remains. It becomes a part of her unconscious, which, if unacknowledged, can be permanently debilitating. Barbara had a lot of trouble with her mother, as had S in the many years that lay ahead. His mother, still a teenager when she had him, never reached the point where she could forestall such outbursts. They came from somewhere inside her mind, which carried scars just like the ones she now inflicted. S could only conjure what these may have been and who had inflicted them. It is too facile to blame the wounds on the horrible environment of her teenage years. At least as far as she was concerned, her childhood was not filled with the horrors she came to know in 1944. Sadly, on the periphery of that childhood, there were plenty of terrible events. The country of her birth, as part of Austria-Hungary, the Entente ally of Germany, was on the losing side in the First World War, and Hungary paid as dearly as any of the defeated nations. The political, military, and social chaos that followed the war destroyed everything that had been built by the liberal Austro-Hungarian system. Dominated by the aristocracy, the system, which lasted until the late 1860s, had begun to be replaced by a parliamentary one modeled on the English example. It was far too bureaucratic and more prone to corruption than its model, but it had managed to create a precarious balance between the two main political centers of Vienna and Budapest. The problems it could never resolve to the satisfaction of the people concerned were the roles of the ethnic minorities and balancing the industrially more advanced economy of Austria and the mostly agricultural and mining-based Hungarian one. An overwhelming portion of the unresolved problems were concentrated in Hungary. Territorially, it was larger than Austria, especially after the Prussian victory at Königgrätz, which resulted in the loss of Silesia to the Prussians and the South Tyrol, as the Austrians called it, to northern Italy. Hungary also had much larger ethnic minorities than Austria. According to a census in 1910, only 51% of Hungary was ethnically Magyar. The rest were Southern, Croat, and Serb Slavs, Romanians, Slovaks, Ruthenians, and other small Slavic groups. Religious differences were also much more extensive. Most Hungarians were Catholics as a result of the Counter-Reformation aggressively pursued by the Habsburgs, but the country also had one of the largest minorities of Lutheran, Calvinist, and other smaller Reformed church groups. It had a Jewish minority of nearly a million people. Despite the discrepancy in size and even in population, Austria still managed to retain a large portion of the power in what came to be known as the Austro-Hungarian monarchy after the above-mentioned defeat of Austria and its German principality allies like Bavaria, Saxony, and Hanover by the armies organized by Count Helmut Moltke. The diplomatic bravura was credited to Otto von Bismarck, whose leadership succeeded in establishing Germany under the rule of the Prussian king. The Kingdom of Hungary remained secondary in the new monarchy, but the many nationalities scattered throughout the lands, emulating the Magyars, wanted greater autonomy and eventually their own nations. The First World War was the death knell for the monarchy, as it was for most of what had been known as European civilization. Kata's immediate family were affected by the chaos before her birth. Her father had served in the military but returned unlike many of his compatriots. David Anjal, after some ups and downs of his department caused by the political swings from one extreme to another, managed to retain his position. He had been cleared by the anti-communist political supervisors at the university and even fought to protect some of his colleagues who were singled out because of their acceptance of positions during the short-lived reign of the communists after the war. Kate's mother, protected by her father, finished her studies at the university and met Antal David, her future husband, there. Ash tried to imagine how these predecessors lived and pursued their goals amidst the chaos and the many dangers that it posed. The trouble with reconstructing family history like this one was that the gaps were the most important parts. The daily lives affected by the joys, pleasures, the pains and disappointments were missing. These had died with his mother, her brother, and parents. Ash could only project his own similar experiences into the lives of his mother and her family. Instead, it was better to stay with the evidence of his own life. Though never complete, it provided a vague outline of the experiences that formed his mother's character. With his clearer view in later years, after he had struggled through the disentangling his own misconceptions, confronting the painful, denied emotions that had accrued inside him over the years of change and transformation that formed the story of his childhood and teenage years, he started to piece together this imagined child, girl, and young mother. The external events that affected the lives of her parents and their own family traumas contributed to forming his mother's first 18 years of life. Her father was born into a large rural Catholic family of 10 children. His father, a coachmaker, had to leave Hungary because of his involvement in a killing that could have landed him in prison for many years. As a result, his mother raised the passel of children with the help of her family on her limited resources, supplemented by whatever financial help her exiled husband sent to them. The family lived in the town of Zemplén on the northern shore of the Danube across from Esztergom. A bridge had spanned the river before the war. It was blown up by the retreating German army and never rebuilt because of the animosity between the Hungarian and Czechoslovak governments, encouraged by the Soviet occupiers who tended to abet rather than mollify such differences. S often saw the remnants of the bridgehead on the Hungarian side and a vague outline of the northern bank. The big arch of the bridge's supporting pillars opened into the broad Danube, which rushed by, scrawled with great swirls and eddies created by the uneven riverbed and the bend that turned the waters from heading east to south a few miles below where the bridge had stood. The fragments of the bridge surface supports stuck out, pointing to the other side like broken arms preserved in rigor mortis. It was one of the remnants of memories his mother must have had. As a child, she and her father and mother had crossed a bridge that was no longer there to visit Antal's family in Zemplén. Antal had told us stories about having crossed the bridge after the First World War when the land north of the Danube was incorporated into Czechoslovakia, and Hungary fought unsuccessfully to remain in control of what had been a part of the country for the previous centuries. As imagined what it must have been like for her mother to see these relics of what had been imposing structures in her childhood and youth, and how these reminded her of the loss of her brother and the many friends who had been killed during or emigrated after the war. It is hard enough to live with the grinding down of illusions from childhood, when there are constant reminders that the sites and environments of childhood are broken or no longer there. There are no illusions of continuity left. S knew from his own experience of having had to abandon his childhood environment how destabilizing that experience was. The older he grew, the more the lost images returned, sharper than before, as if his memories were trying to preserve those childhood scenes ingrained in his unconscious. It was a way for the spirit to fight off the impending disappearance of objects that create the framework for our illusion of reality. There was no way for him to know how these reminders of transitoriness affected Kata's mental development. But he knew that in her struggle, she was not helped by her husband, preoccupied with maintaining what they had and planning for ways to overcome the growing uncertainty he and his family faced. He couldn't provide the emotional crutches which might have helped her navigate the discontinuities. The physical environment was either broken or damaged around them, and the social conventions, the illusion of stability that had been torn to shreds, only to be replaced by new ones based on distortions and lies supported by threat and terror. She needed the constancy of a loving partner who could reassure her with the certainty of his support. S could only imagine as he became more conscious and could interpret the responses of his parents to the events in their lives, how and why they failed. His mother's eventual decline into full-fledged psychosis started with the breakup of her marriage to George in her mid-40s. She couldn't accept the dissolution of this last tenuous certainty. Her denial took many forms. First, she raved with damning, repulsive invectives at her ex-husband and her one-time friend who had stolen him from her. Her pejoratives like "that whore" became the phrases with which S's family used to conjure her memory. The way she transformed from a middle-aged, blonde, round-faced, slightly plump woman with a wide grin into a raging, screaming harpy was a scary memory for S's children, who, with S's help, transformed that memory into humorous parody. That was the only way anyone close to her could relate to these outbursts without sliding into a lightless world of horror. She acted out her rage and the terrors of abandonment in ways from which most of the family were spared. Only S, who spent 4 years living in her house when she was in her late 60s, had the displeasure to bear the scars of her morphoses. One night, one of these confronted him on a landing at the top of the stairs as she was headed to the bathroom. These memories haunted him like nightmares. The impressions of his childhood, as far for all of us, remained imprinted in the lowest reaches of his soul, so that even in his 70s, S often woke up from a dream that involved disappointment and rejection. As was made clear when he became a grandfather and his parenting methods contrasted to those of his daughters, the memory of his parents leaving him alone in a hotel room in the evening or in their apartment in the city when they went out were the experiences at the roots of these dreams. Even at times when his grandmother, Paula, stayed with him until he fell asleep were counted among these, since he knew that she eventually had to leave him. Many years of therapy had taught him how to interpret these story fragments, amounting to metaphors, connected to the memories of being left alone and to his relationship to his parents. Although the ability to do that helped him make it through life, allowed him to live without the crippling effects of unacknowledged trauma, by the nature of the experience, something unresolved remained. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't rewrite his personal history. The most he could do was pay attention to these dreams, understand their camouflaged messages, making it possible to bear the burden. That is it for today. I hope you're liked or are interested in the story and want to hear some more. I will continue it in the next couple days. Again, if you liked it, please press the like button. And also, if you like this and other videos, subscribe to the Citizen Speaks website and support my continuing doing these. Thank you and have a good day.